Welcome to episode 3 of Time Out for Black History. In this episode, we will be examining the Middle Passage and, more importantly, kind of the individual journey that the African slave took from capture until arrival in the New World. I also wanted to, quickly emphasize what I'm hoping this series will accomplish. I'm hoping that by the end of this, that you will have a very good understanding of the African experience and eventually the African American experience in America from capture in Africa until the current Black Lives Matter movement. And with that, you'll have a great understanding. I envision this will probably take about 4 hours of overall content. 10-minute quick hits on specific moments. And again, you won't be an expert, but you'll have a very good understanding of the African American experience, which I think allows you to better understand the world we live in today. So once again, I ask that you please share this. After this episode's done, if you could go on and put it onto Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, whatever, I don't know. Any way to get the word out so that more people can have access to it, I'd really appreciate it. So let me start this episode with a quote from William Wilberforce. He was a British abolitionist, and he said, "Never can so much misery be found condensed in so small a place as a ship on the Middle Passage." And so I always love that because it so embodies what this experience was for these individuals. So what we're referring to, once again, is the transatlantic slave trade. And we're all familiar with this. This is one of those things they did teach us in middle school or high school. You had the 3 legs of the journey. You had the journey from England or Europe to Africa, and they brought textiles, alcohol, and guns into Africa. And we're all familiar with the portion from the Americas to England or Europe, which brought sugar and coffee, kind of the raw goods. But the section we're going to focus on is the section referred to as the Middle Passage. And why we're going to focus on this one is because it really is the one that, when you talk about the horrors of humanity, the sale of human beings, the rest of it was all part of the exchange, the exchange between the New World and the Old World. But we're going to focus on this specific one called the Middle Passage. Now, the 1600s started this movement, on a larger scale into the New World. And that was because of increases in agriculture. So the need for labor, we're going to see that increase. And we talked in the last episode, they tried indentured servitude. Bacon's Rebellion ended that one. They tried Native American slavery, but the natives died off in huge numbers and weren't, they had a knowledge of the land so they could escape, things like that. And so African slavery became the norm for a number of reasons. One, very difficult to escape once captured, resilient to European diseases, better than Native Americans were, had a knowledge of farming and those kind of things. And so there were considerable components as to why African slavery made sense to the Europeans. And I think the greatest of those reasons was the distinction of black slave, white not slave, which is one of the problems with indentured servitude. Now, those numbers are going to really increase once we hit the 1700s. 3/5 of all black people that arrived in the New World came during the 1700s. And we talked already, the 1500s, the Spanish controlled it, the 1600s, the Dutch controlled it, the 1700s, the British and the French controlled it, primarily the British. And it's important we kind of understand, that those different groups controlled it at different times. So, what was it like for the individual? So one of the problems we have with this era is the lack of information that we can find. Because typically those that were being enslaved and taken could not read and write. They didn't document their stories. So most of what we know comes from the stories of a few that articulate out what happened to them. And so we'll start with the individual capture. And we talked about that in the last episode, so I'm just going to kind of just re-emphasize it. You could be caught through abduction. You could be caught through war. It could be debt or a crime, things like that. But essentially, you were taken from West Africa, Central Africa. Now, this journey to the coast could take anywhere from weeks to months, being traded from one individual to another individual and eventually arriving on the East Coast. So they traveled in what were known as coffles. And we know already that many died on this journey. If you weren't strong enough to make this 3-month journey to the coast, then many died on this journey. And so it's important that we know that there were casualties in this trade that didn't happen on a boat, the thing that we think about the most. You know, they happened in the wars. They happened on the transportation from the interior to the coast of Africa. Okay? So upon arrival, they arrived to the coast, and there they had slave fortresses, slave factories. Lomboko, Elmina were some of the more famous. Cape Coast Castle Slave Fortress was another one. These were large, giant castle fortresses that either the Portuguese, they handed them one group to the next. Whoever was dominating the trade controlled the fortresses. And there would be slave pens down below where you'd be held. And the reality is you could be held there for a couple days, a couple weeks, a couple months, even years. You were held there until somebody purchased you. And so, again, a lot of death happened in these slave fortresses. Because I think it's important that we realize that the access to the slave in Africa was not difficult in the 16 and 1700s. So they were viewed as a commodity. And so when that commodity was useful, it'd be taken care of. When that commodity was not useful, it wouldn't be taken care of. So these slave fortresses would also sell, resources like gold and ivory and other things. But primarily, again, we're focusing on the sale of human beings. One of the most, at Elmina, they had right below the slave fortress was a church. And so they say that during church, they could hear the cries of the slaves in the slave pen below. And, somehow this was an acceptable practice by those who were committing these atrocities. So they would wait, and as the slave ships arrived, the slaves would be brought out and essentially bought by the ships. Now, because oftentimes on a certain ship there'd be several different slave companies trading, they would often brand the slave with the name of the company that was buying that particular slave. So this is going to be one of those things later on when we think about Uncle Tom's Cabin, when we think about a lot of the abolitionist movement, the mutilation of individuals just like they were a cow or a bookshelf where you put the name of the company on them. And they would say that they would be extra delicate with women, but women would still get the brand. And so that would lead us to the most infamous piece of this journey, which was the actual Middle Passage. After a while, there's going to be a huge distinction between the beginning of the trade and the end of the trade. In the beginning of the trade, the casualty rate was astronomical. As sailing techniques were more ancient, medical attention was more ancient. As those things begin to advance, we start seeing the casualty rates begin to decline. But upon boarding, men and women would be separated. Men would typically be paired up and would be bound with leg irons and arm irons and sometimes neck irons. And they'd be packed so tight down below that there wasn't much movement allowed. The women would be kept separate, and the women would often be violated during the trip. And one of the reasons for separating was that there was no protection for these women in the Middle Passage. Now, the deck down below, again, there wasn't access to restrooms and things, so everybody did what they did on the floor of the ship, and then they laid in it. So you're talking about feces, urine, menstrual blood, vomit, everything possible was down in that ship. They kept the hatches open when the weather was good. When the weather got bad, they'd shut the hatches. And so you can imagine the smell. They say sharks would follow the ships due to the smell. They also say that if you could dry up the Atlantic Ocean, you could see the exact route of the slave ships because of the amount of people that were thrown off those boats over the time and the bones that would line the bottom of the ocean. They'd be fed once or twice a day, kind of just like a cornmeal type of thing. Those that were healthy would be fed more than those that weren't because it was a numbers game. On any trip, you're talking 10 to 20% casualties. You start with 100, you're good if you arrive there with 90 or 80. And again, when you're talking about human beings, that's what the mindset was. They're going to model it after something that became known as the Brooks model. And this was the perfect way to pack your slave ship. It became law by the late 1700s that you couldn't exceed a certain capacity, 296 slaves, I believe it was. But you would have some captains who were considered tight packers who would overpack the ship in hopes of making that big score, and others that underpacked in the hope of arriving with full bodies. And so upon arrival in the New World, we'll get into a whole nother discussion about auctions, the seasoning process, all that kind of stuff. But I just wanted you to get a little bit of an idea about what existed on this portion of the Middle Passage. If you have any questions or want any elaboration on anything, feel free to comment. I'm really hoping that this picks up and we can really begin to engage in some good discourse and understanding about everything that happened and how we can remedy those things. Thanks again for listening, and I look forward to the next episode.